I think it's important to listen to different podcasts, figure out what you like from them, what people's styles are, and then write some of those things down and figure out what's really authentic to you. If you're copying other people, that's going to come across as well. Figure out like, hey, what makes me unique? What do people normally come to me for? And I asked people this before I started my show. I said, hey, if I had one superpower, what would it be? And I sent it to 11 different people, my mom, an old boss, an old roommate, people I worked with. And I got all sorts of responses from them, and it helped me to figure out what set me apart from other people. And then with a little bit of analyzing, I figured out how that was going to shine through on my podcast. So figure out what works for you and then have that in every episode.
Welcome to the Audience Coach Podcast, the show where coaches in the health and wellness field will find experiences, insights, advice, and resources for building and growing their audiences. Spread your message, create a community, increase your online presence. New episodes every week. Ready to take action? When you record a podcast interview, how can you manage to squeeze as much value as possible from your guests and share that with your audience? How can you make sure that the episode keeps your audience engaged and connected? Listeners have the pleasure of getting the episodes in their best and final form. But week after week, the minds behind the show have the challenge of making sure the content is compelling and inspiring. So in order to know the secrets behind recording health and wellness podcasts that are entertaining, inspiring, and incredibly educational, I decided to talk to someone whose show very well features all of these characteristics. In this episode, we have Melissa Monte, host of the Mind Love podcast, a show that focuses on stories and strategies for self-transformation. She is particularly mindful in the way she structures her episodes and delivers her interviews. And you can notice it in every new release. Melissa shares her knowledge on creating podcast interviews that leave strong footprints in the minds of your listeners. Some of the key points she covers are how to come up with new podcast ideas, how to pick the right guests, and how to make an emotional connection with your listeners through your content. There are so many actionable tips in this interview that you don't want to be distracted for a second. We took care of organizing all these tips and links in the show notes, so make sure to check those as well at audiencecoach.com. So Melissa, My Love, that is your show. It's a great show. I've been listening to it for a while. And I would like for you to share with our audience, a little bit of a story behind My Love. Why and where did it origin? Where does it come from?
Well, I'd say my training for the topic began when I was pretty young. I've always been a seeker. I've loved learning new information, especially about just human optimization. And I remember being really young and understanding that there was power to the mind. I remember learning in elementary school the idea of mind over matter and how I used it to increase my mile time in PE, just running the mile and being like, I think I can run this the whole way through. So I've always had this little idea that our mind is a powerful thing and it can either propel us forward or hold us back. But as life got in the way, I started to forget that. I was hit by a few traumas in my teen years and going through my early 20s, and it really started to affect what I believed about myself and what I was capable of. And I found myself in a downward spiral. I developed a heavy eating disorder. I was partying all the time, doing drugs. I was prescribed a lot of Adderall. I just wasn't in a good place. And my life really started to reflect that. It was like my inner state was coming out and developing in my outer state. And so it took me really reaching a rock bottom to realize that I needed to do something to drag myself out of it. So I started with just reading a lot of books, learning other perspectives. It took a while to really get the strength to apply it to my life. But between that and starting yoga, surrounding myself with different people, I started to really realize how much power I had in my own life. And a lot of it just started with a shift in perspective. So during this time, I was climbing out of my trauma, but I was also still lost in life. I was working for different people, not really fulfilled in what I was doing. And I then reached another breaking point of just being like, I need to find something that gives me purpose. And you'd hear about like this idea of some big grand purpose. The
Yes.
more I put pressure on myself with it, the more I held myself back from it. It was like I was trying to find one thing so I wouldn't find anything. So I eventually just decided, okay, I'm going to do something that makes me happy. And I started a podcast on the side after trying a couple of other entrepreneur journeys and realizing it wasn't for me. I got really intentional about it. And I started to ask myself questions like, what am I endlessly curious about? What do I have the willingness and the motivation to learn, even if I'm not getting paid for it? And all of these came back to the books I was reading and the things I wanted to learn to help my own life. And I thought, well, what if I could just share everything that I know? People are already coming to me and asking me these questions in my personal life. So what if I just started a show about it? And there were different avenues to share this. You can start a blog, a YouTube channel. But for me, I could always talk myself out of being on camera. I would get too caught in my head writing. I would try to be perfectionist about it. And I love to talk. So I'm just like, well, let me try a podcast. And once I had that idea, I just took off with it running.
That's awesome. So the podcast is both part of your quest in a way of helping other people with their own quests.
Definitely. A lot of times my podcast episodes are just things where I'm like, what am I struggling with today? What do I wish I could just speak to an expert about for an hour? And because of that, it ends up being really authentic.
Yes, yes. I think that pretty much covers the next questions, but I'm still gonna go into those. And for example, one thing I really appreciate about Mind Love is that you manage to cover awesome topics. You manage to have awesome guests, and the questions you have are also great. What is the process for you to generate the idea for a new episode? Does it come from a personal experience necessarily, or is just a topic you found online or somewhere that you would like to cover, or maybe it's a guest that you would like to have in the show?
It's all of those things, actually. When I first started, I wrote just a huge list of podcast topic ideas, which was really helpful because when I first thought about starting a podcast, I thought it was going to be about holistic health. I had recently become vegan. I was changing out all my products to clean products, and it was something I was really passionate about. And I started to dump down all these ideas of topics for podcasts. And I got to about 20 and I was like, okay, I'm already bored of this. And that's what helped me expand to the mindset idea because I realized I could keep writing for endless ideas. So I wrote down things that I still wanted to learn. I wrote down things that had really changed my life. I wrote down ideas that I heard from other people. And I still kind of use a blend of this. So I'll get a lot of emails from people. When they sign up for my email list, I actually ask them, please reply back to this email in the welcome email and reply back with something you'd like to learn about on the show. And I'll put it in the idea list. And so the ones that come up that I find are really intriguing, I will write down in my list of potential topics. And the ones that have already been covered, it gives me a reason to interact with them a little bit, which helps to engage my fans. So it really does come from everywhere, especially when you start getting into 100 something episodes. A lot of the things that I've already worked through have already been topics. And so it's helpful to get that feedback from your audience. It helps to keep that connection between you and somebody that otherwise you'd just be broadcasting to. So I use those ideas. And when I run out of them, sometimes I just like to scan through Amazon and look at different best selling topics of books or Facebook events to see what topics are being posted from people. So there's a lot of different ways to get ideas for the topics. And then I just decide on the ones that intrigue me the most.
All right. So when it comes to topics, you use both your personal experience and your audience. So your audience is paramount here because they are the ones that are constantly like feeding that idea list for you to generate new episodes, right?
Yes.
And when it comes to guests, what is the process or how do you manage to pick your guests?
This has evolved over time. I've always kept a list of a wish list of the top guests that I want on there, and a ton of them I still haven't gotten on the show, and some of them I have. But in the beginning, it's a little bit more difficult to get these big names like best-selling authors. So what I did back then is first I wrote down anybody in my personal circle that was inspiring to me, that had some sort of business, maybe they wrote a book, maybe they were working towards something or I had a great life story. Another route that I took is I actually looked at Facebook and meetup events or Eventbrite. And what's great about this is that you find people that are just getting started, but they've done the work to have honed one topic or idea enough to speak on it well because they're planning either an in person or a virtual event. So I found that that was a really great way where people were almost always willing to come on the show because they're already trying to promote themselves. And so even if you have a smaller audience, it gives them a chance to practice what they're teaching and they have a willingness to spend that hour with you.
Okay, that's great. So you got to start small first.
Yeah, and don't let that stop you from reaching out to bigger people. My tip for reaching out to bigger people when you are a smaller show is to first get involved with their community. So this is a long game if you really want a specific person on your show. Certain people, one in particular, one of my favorite spiritual guides is a man named Paul Selig. He has 8 best-selling books. He's one of the top spiritual leaders in the world right now. And what I did is I started following him. I've read all his books already. I thought it would be quite a while till I could get him on my show. But what I decided to do is first I did read all of his books. I joined his Facebook community. I would comment in there so he would get to know my name. I then signed up for an in-person workshop that was happening locally that I went to one day. I made sure I got a photo with him and spoke to him for a little bit. It cost hundreds of dollars to go to this event, but I knew it was worth it, even just to be there in general because I loved him so much. And then I reached out to him a week or so later, right around the time he was coming out with a new book. And I wrote a really good pitch email, which I'll get into in a minute. But I also attached the photo of me and him and said, "Hey, I've been following you forever. This is how you've impacted me. I was at a recent event of yours. Will you be willing to come on my show?" And when you do all that, it's kind of hard to say no to somebody at that point. But it is also imperative to present yourself professionally. So for me, I had a background in startups. I knew how to write pitch decks, and I knew there were a few different key points in reaching out in that email. Some of it might be including validation. And validation in the beginning might not be your download numbers. It might be the business that you created before that or something that you've done in the past. For me, I had launched my podcast by taking a course from Pat Flynn. And I, again, took the extra investment and did the in-person workshop so he knew who I was. And I started to write in my emails, "Hey, I'm mentoring under Pat Flynn, top entrepreneur in the world, named by Forbes, blah, blah, blah." All of these things, I was basically using his validation as my validation. But I met him in person and I told him he was going to be my mentor. So sometimes you got to be creative with it and do whatever it takes to really stand out and show that you are somebody that's not just going to do a few episodes and let the show go. This is something that means a lot to you, and you're going to do what you can to not only grow your own show, but to promote their episode.
And I think from what you say is also not just reaching out to the person, but actually establishing a really deep connection with the person and their work and their story.
Definitely. You can't really expect somebody to invest time with you if you haven't invested time with them. And it's really clear if somebody's just reaching out trying to get whoever on their brand new show. It's like, I'm not huge, but people do that to me all the time where I'm just like, you don't even know who I am. Like, I have other things to do, you know? But if it's somebody that's like, I've been following you for a while and I like that you offer this, this, and this, they know something about me, I'm way more likely to want to spend that hour with them. I mean, time is valuable. So keep that in mind when you're reaching out to somebody, especially somebody with limited time on their hands.
Yes, something I've noticed in my love is that you always do a very deep research of your guests, and if they have books, like mostly or most of the times, you have read at least one of their books.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different ways to do this as well. You can get a lot of information just from Amazon. If you go to their book and use the little look inside feature, you can read the first part of their book, or you can send a sample to your Kindle and get the first few chapters. That alone can give you topic ideas around what you want to talk about, what you want to ask about. You can look on their Instagram, you can go to their LinkedIn. People these days, especially if they're a public figure, have a lot of information about them out there. And I don't like to have generic shows. I like to have one topic per person that we really dive deep into. It helps, first of all, to really get deep into one subject matter instead of surface level of 15 different broad questions. It also helps to theme that episode, which really helps with podcast SEO. If you write an episode that's like, this episode is all about self love and mindfulness and yoga and eating and all of these things, it doesn't even know what, when somebody's searching, the podcast apps won't even know what to bring you up for. But if you have one episode all about overcoming emotional eating and all of these different things within that, the people that are looking for help on that one topic are more likely to click it. The podcast apps know what to rank you for, and you can get a lot deeper into the subject matter.
Yes, that's something that I've noticed in a lot of health and wellness shows, and it's that they are too broad in their episodes. Like, the more specific you can be, the better.
Definitely. And when you really think about it, the only time you really want to have all these broad conversations, if I had a really big name and I was like, okay, well, this episode is all about Elon Musk, we might cover a huge range of topics because I just want to know about him. He is the topic. But I think a mistake that a lot of people make is it's like, okay, here's Melissa Monte. Not a lot of people know my name. Let's talk about everything she's ever thought of before. It's just not that interesting. People aren't coming to learn about you, they're coming to learn about what your expertise is. And so the more you can remember that and hone it around those ideas of how it's going to help somebody, the better.
Okay. Now you made me think about the pitch email. What are 2 or 3 tips you can give our audience about how to create a nice pitch email so they can reach out to very, very nice or very important or relevant authors and thought leaders?
Keep it short and break up the paragraphs a lot. It makes skimming more likely to actually read the contents of your email. Start out by showing that you know who they are, that you've done some research and you're invested in wanting them to come on your show. So if they've written a book, a lot of times I'll say, hey, I'm reading this book. I like this, this, and this, and I'd love to make a podcast episode about it. So that way you're getting to your intention and what you know about them. Use some validation about either yourself, your business, or your podcast, whatever's the greatest. Who are you? How is it going to benefit them? Like, this will also go out to my email list of this amount, or I will also be sharing this across my social platforms. And then basically how long it will take. So I put those 4 things in all of my emails. It's still pretty short. It's easy to get through in just a quick skim, but it also sets valid expectations. I also make sure that I follow up with each of these people. So at first I used a Trello board, everyone that I reached out to. If they didn't respond back within a week's time, I'd kind of just put a friendly little bump up. A lot of times people just need to see it a couple of times and then they're like, okay, can't just ignore this person. And yeah, those 4 things really, really do help in the beginning, but also see what works for you. Play with a few different emails, get analytical about it. Keep a spreadsheet even. I did this in the beginning too, where I had 3 versions of emails and I tracked which ones got responses. And then I started using the one that was getting responded to the most often.
Okay, that's awesome. I'm taking a lot of notes here because that's super important information that it's very useful, but it's not talked about that much.
I think a lot of things are that way. But the more that you could look at every aspect of your business as your profession, like how can I get better at this part of my job? Just focus on one at a time. And if you look at them all at a time, it can get overwhelming, but that's the fun of tweaking your business and making it better. So just focus on one area and it might just be your pitch email. Next area might be your interviews, and just get better over time. And as long as you're constantly progressing, so will your business.
Okay, Melissa, I have one more question about the pitch email before we move on to the structure of your episodes. And it is many times it is not easy to reach out to the person directly when it's a very famous author or thought leader. Maybe you have to do it through somebody in their business or through somebody they know. So how do you do that when the person cannot be reached out to directly?
Most people have some sort of contact information on their website. I use a Chrome plugin called Email Hunter, and when you go to their website, you just press the little icon at the top of your browser and it'll pull up any emails that are scraped from that website. So, if you can't reach out to them through that, then go to Instagram, LinkedIn, however you can. And usually you'll either get in touch with an assistant or a PR person, or you will at least get them to connect you to that person. So, one of the things I also do is I will actually go to different PR websites and see who they're representing as well, which can give you ideas for guests and topics.
All right, that's awesome. I've seen Joe Pulizzi, who I'm sure you know. He uses Twitter to reach out to potential guests. Okay, now let's move a little bit onto the structure of your show. I noticed that the beginning of every single episode of Mind Love is just captivating. Okay, all of your interviews are preceded by a tremendously captivating introduction. How do you design an interview introduction that will immediately hook the listener?
First, I get to the point of what we're actually going to be talking about and how it's going to be relevant to the listener. And then I like to follow it up with a personal story because that's what actually engages people. It grounds the topic idea into reality. It also helps people get to know me a little bit and shows me to be an expert of the show. If I got right into the interview without doing an intro, it would be all about the guests and there wouldn't be very much self promotion. So you got to keep that idea of what am I trying to grow here, my own business, or am I trying to help everybody else's business only? So I add that. And then I like to add some things that we're actually going to learn in the episode so that they know why to stick around. I also include a teaser of some of the best content that kind of sums up what we'll be talking about so they can get a feel of what the guest will sound like. So all of those things combined, I think, really help to draw in the listener.
Great, great. And you also add a comment, right? Right in between the ideas that you refer to, like you mentioned the core ideas from the interview, but you also comment on them before jumping into the interview.
Yeah, I think that's what really helps people get to know me a little bit more. It helps them stay
Mhm.
connected to me. And it also shows them, I try to pick a story from my life that will somehow relate the most to listeners or bring up something that people don't talk about that much. One of my main goals in my podcast is to reduce shame. I think there's so many things that are just human aspects of life that people don't talk about a lot. So sometimes it comes across as a little bit of shock factor. Like people are like, I can't believe you said that on a podcast. But I think that it shows people that, there's more that we can talk about and we're not going to get hurt by talking about it. So I think just having that vulnerability combined with authenticity really connects people to me as well.
Yes, I can relate to that because I think even though I wasn't originally part of your intended target audience, I've heard listened to a lot of your episodes, and in most of them, I feel like you're talking to me, you're talking about me, about the issues and problems I'm going through. So it's super relatable.
Yeah, and I think even just the tone, your tone will change if you have one person in mind. A lot of people come to the microphone and they're thinking about broadcasting to a huge range of people. But notice that when you're standing on a stage and speaking, your tone will sound different than if you're sitting next to your best friend and talking to her. So I like to have one person in mind as I'm speaking because it'll just shift my tone into one of more familiarity, which I think really does come across.
Okay, now let's move on to how you formulate questions. And I think this has to do with your podcast topics or your episode topics being super specific, and that helps this part too. So, every of your questions immediately generates a mind blowing answer. And that answer is followed usually by actionable advice from your guest. So, what is the criteria and process for you to create your questions? Because they always get the best from your guest.
I do spend a good amount of time formulating questions, but I also allow myself the freedom to stray from that. So I basically put down a bunch of talking points. A lot of them I don't get to at all. And if one kind of pulls a thread towards another one, I will allow myself to go there. This does take practice, though. You have to really get into flow of your interviews. And I will admit, in the beginning, it was a lot harder to do this. I was nervous. I had never done an interview before. I was still getting the hang of it. And so I was thinking so much about my next question that it was really difficult to get into flow. But that's part of the thing that I think helped me in the beginning was I was really willing to sit there and spend a lot of time editing on my own, my first 50 episodes or so, to re-listen, figure out again I was getting guests that weren't quite as perfectionist with speaking. They didn't have as much experience, so a lot of times they would ramble, and I would spend time editing out the best information so that I was only portraying the best information. I would even rearrange things if they were rambling or scattered. So not only did this help me figure out what I could have done better in each episode, it was kind of like I was assessing my own performance. It also helped me learn which questions evoked the best responses. So now it really is something that I find to be one of my strengths where I'm just in flow. I close my eyes most of the time during interviews. So I feel like I'm in one brainwave and just like a stream of information. And a lot of times I feel guided towards the next question. But that's also because I've done a lot of research on them. I spend at least an hour researching. Even if I've already read their book, I will then write down all these different topics. I'll put them in an order that makes sense that I think it would flow into. First, starting with their story. I already know a lot of their story, so I know what I'm going to grab from there. And it sounds really fluid that I'm pulling from something they just said. So people won't realize that I've pre planned some of that stuff. But again, the more you get the hang of it, the more you can just kind of flow and take notes also on what they're saying during the interview so that if they said something intriguing, you can dive deeper into that one specific area.
Okay, Melissa, you just told us that you have improved your skill for creating questions and for conducting interviews throughout a lot of practice and self-reflection. Is there a conscious way or a conscious action that you take in order to keep interviews on track? Because sometimes you like one can have the tendency, either the host or the guest, to jump onto different topics or to jump onto different ideas. How do you manage to keep everything on track?
Again, that kind of comes from the outline that I create where I'm like, okay, these are the things I know I want to get to. These are the things that I'm okay if we don't get to. And sometimes, as long as it's fluid and it's still on the topic that I've wanted to create for that show, I will let it flow where it needs to flow. But sometimes, you know how it can be where a guest can just start talking about something that maybe they're interested in, and that's great and everything. And you can either, what I like to do a lot, and this comes naturally to me, but it doesn't come naturally to everybody, is I'm able to kind of think ahead. And I have so many stories from my life that I'm easily able to recall that I'm like, oh, there was a time that this relates to something else. And I can draw my own story from what they just ended on onto a new topic. But you can also just say, like just stop them after that and just say, something I really want to get to is this, this, and this. And so if you have that outline and you've maybe highlighted or put a star next to the things that you know you want to make sure you get to, then just skip right to that. People do it all the time. It's not going to feel that awkward or anything. And I think people appreciate when you guide them back to the topic at hand. I've had people say, I have a tendency to ramble, so I'm really glad that you guided us back to the topic, or even say beforehand. So it is your show, and feel free to guide the conversation as you want it to be.
And there is also another aspect of interviews, and it's like sometimes there are some topics that are easy or relatively easy to deal with or to approach. But there are other topics that are a little bit more complex. It can be either because they are very technical or because they are very complex. So, how do you manage to make those kind of heavy or complex topics? How do you turn them into more fluid and engaging interviews?
Well, there's two aspects of this. If you're doing a topic that's more technical, it can be boring to listen to. So keep that in mind and figure out which things that you want to be audio based and which things might be better as a video, or say like is a good example to guide people to your website to say, hey, if you want these steps listed out, come to my website. I have a downloadable. And then that's a great opportunity to gather an email from them. But a lot of the topics of the complexities that I deal with are more like it's a hard topic to discuss, or people hold shame around it, or it's personal, or just difficult to bring back up. And I think I do ask people, is there anything that you don't want to cover? And most of the time, if they're already a public figure, they're fine covering these things. They've made it their life working through these hard things to talk about. And then the rest of it comes from how my energy is around the topic. Because so much of my mission is to just reduce shame around anything, I've always been really comfortable approaching hard topics. But that's something that you have to ask yourself. If you are not comfortable talking about this, it's going to come through to your audience. So that's okay, though. You don't have to be. And just decide where your boundaries are in life in general, and meet your podcast with those boundaries and stay within them. And you're going to come across as more authentic than forcing something that you don't feel good about.
Great, great. That's awesome. Melissa, when it comes to doing interviews in the health and wellness field, what do you think makes an interview a great interview?
A couple things. First, there should be personal stories in there. If somebody's coming and just talking about all of these steps or technical things or whatever to help a current problem, it doesn't add a lot of visuals, and this is an audio platform. And so you have to realize that you need to guide them to create the visuals in the listeners' minds. And so that's why I usually start by asking people's backgrounds. I like to ask for examples of things or times in people's lives when this was applicable, or an example of how this worked for them, so that they get into a deep story. A lot of times they will lighten up a little bit too. You can hear the expressions on their faces. You can hear when they're smiling or when they're going somber, and those things make for an engaging show. And then I like to have actionable advice. So, what can a listener take from this and apply it to their life right now, instead of it just being a concept that's floating around on the internet?
So you need to tell a story and give actionable advice.
Right. And you can also see what works for you. Like, I think it's important to listen to different podcasts, figure out what you like from them, what people's styles are, and then write some of those things down and figure out what's really authentic to you. If you're copying other people, that's going to come across as well. Figure out like, hey, what makes me unique? What do people normally come to me for? And I asked people this before I started my show. I said, hey, if I had one superpower, what would it be? And I sent it to 11 different people: my mom, an old boss, an old roommate, people I worked with. And I got all sorts of responses from them, and it helped me figure out what set me apart from other people. And then with a little bit of analyzing, I figured out how that was going to shine through on my podcast. So figure out what works for you and then have that in every episode.
All right. Sounds great. Okay. You're giving us a lot of awesome advice here. Melissa, when it comes to interviews, what have been common problems or setbacks or challenges you've had? It can be either technical or in terms of the topics or in terms of the guests. What are common issues that you've had when doing your interviews?
The first one that comes to mind is just guests in general, especially in the beginning when you're just trying to find people to come on your show. You might get people that are just not good podcast guests. So one time I found somebody that was a Facebook admin, and this was a really great strategy for finding people with an audience. I would find really large Facebook groups and look at who their admins were, and it might be around like yoga, or this one in particular was around the whole zero waste lifestyle. And this person had like 30,000 people in their group. So I'm like, okay, they must be a leader. And I brought them on my show, and it was just not a good interview at all. Like, I would ask a question and there'd be like a 20-second pause, and then she'd respond like this. And I was like, oh my gosh. And some people feel obligated to post those episodes. I do not realize that this is a reflection of you. And so I did end up just saying, um, hey, that didn't pass my my content team. So I'm gonna hold off on this episode. But if there's any other way I can support you, let me know. I love what you're doing. Blah blah blah. Or a lot of times they kind of know, and you just don't have to say anything. There's been a few times that the guest has been not up to my content standards, and I just said there were audio issues. I'm so sorry. And so know that it's your platform. You own it, and you don't have to post something you're not proud of. So that's been one of the things. And then, of course, there's always technical issues. I used to be embarrassed about them, but then you start to realize that there's just always going to be technical issues no matter what. Most people are very understanding about it. So just take some time beforehand to make sure your microphone's working. Do a little test recording to make sure everything sounds okay. Make sure your microphone's turned on or up so that you don't just have a one sided interview. All of these things have happened to me at different times, but again, it's just kind of part of the process. And we're living in a weird digital age where most people are at home right now. And a lot of people that have never used Zoom before are now using it. So I think everyone understands.
Yes, I've been there. I've been working with this for years, and it still happens to me that I realize I didn't set up the right microphone after 10 minutes of hitting recording. So yeah, it happens even to the experts.
For sure.
Okay, Melissa, to wrap up, what are 3 tips you will give people who want to interview health coaches or wellness coaches to pull out the best interview ever?
Find people that specialize in one thing or have at least honed one thing in a workshop or a book or something along those lines, and show them that you know who they are, that you've been following them, or again, I like to engage with their community. So before I reach out to them, I might make sure that I'm liking their Instagram posts for a week or two or even longer, or I'm joining their Facebook community, or I actually buy their book so that I can respond back to them and say, hey, I'm loving your book. This part really hit home and this part hit home. Not only does it give them confidence that you know, it's a symbiotic relationship, but it also shows them that it's going to be a better interview because they know who you are. The amount
Mm-hmm.
of times that I've gotten feedback from a guest that says, thank you so much for actually reading my book or for actually looking through my book. And not all the time do I read the full book. You can get a lot of information just by reading through the chapter titles and diving into one that really calls out to you, or just flipping to a few different pages and reading some paragraphs. So it takes some research time, but you don't need to read the whole book start to finish to really get an idea of what they're talking about and what they bring to the table. So as long as you know those things, it's a lot easier to reach out to them. And then again, writing a good email to connect with them, and maybe even figuring out how you can give them value at the same time. So, what I like to do is I find people that are just about to launch something, whether it's a new program or a new book, or they're trying to grow their Facebook community. And if you come in knowing that and say, hey, I saw you're just launching this new program. I'd love to help you promote it. Or I saw that you just launched a YouTube channel along with your Instagram account. I'd love to help you promote that, whatever it is, then they are not only impressed, but they also have motivation to come on and just get as much publicity as possible.
Great, great. Okay, that's a lot of valuable information, Melissa. I really, really appreciate everything you're sharing with us right now. Okay, Melissa, so I think that's all for this interview. I would like to know where we can find you. I mean, your podcast is huge, but I know you are also on social media. So let us know, where can we find you, and where can we find Mind Love?
Mind Love is on all your favorite podcast platforms. Just search Mind Love, 2 words. You can also find me at mindlove.com. I do have a daily email list called the Morning Mind Love that's just full of little tidbits of inspiration to start your day on the right foot. And you can sign up for that at mindlove.com, or just text the word morning to 33777. And then I'm also, of course, on social at mindlovemelissa.
Great. We're going to be adding all those links to the show notes. So you're going to be alert to visit audiencecoach.com and find the links to go to Melissa Monte's website, to her podcast website and sign up for her Mind Love email list. So, Melissa, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. It's been a blast.
If you found this episode useful, please share it directly with someone you know is going to find it useful too, and also on social media. We'll be very glad to give you more valuable content. Send us all of your questions, concerns, challenges, and ideas so we can cover them in future episodes. Reach us at audiencecoach.com/contact or on Instagram at audience.coach. To help us grow and support us in creating more valuable content, please rate and comment on this show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or any other app you're using. Until next time.